variety of human experiences and to try and remain unbiased, it's not enough to just gather ethnography on one group of people. You need to be able to compare. And so using that terminology, and this is the reason why you need to remain objective in your ethnography, you need to describe it from an etic perspective, because then you take one ethnography and you compare it to another ethnography, and you say, okay, they are the same in these respects, and they're different in these other respects. And that is what we call an ethnology, and that is the study of people, or of a people. So an ethnography is a description of a set of data around one group of people, and an ethnology is a comparative study of more than one group. And what you're trying to get at with the ethnology is to see these general patterns, not just the specific particulars about the way one group of people operates, but how people in general organize themselves into general groups. This allows us to formulate theories which are frameworks for understanding. Now, I am primarily an archaeologist, which means that I look at past cultures, and you may know what an archaeologist is already. You may have seen popular representations of archaeologists. They're all 100% true. Indiana Jones is totally real. I'm joking. Archaeology, let me demystify it a little bit, is not about a particular time or place. Archaeology can be about 5 minutes ago or 5 million years ago. It is about anything from the past. It can be recent past, it can be ancient. But what it is it's a perspective of looking at the human past through the material remains that are left behind. So if you were to get up and walk out of your house and leave everything behind, just walk out with the clothes on your back and everything that you leave behind and never go back to it, an archaeologist would be able to go in there and map everything and record everything the way you left it and tell you something about yourself, maybe even something that you didn't know was real or that was true. Now, you might say, okay, why is this not history? Because the history deals with the past. Well, history has a very specific meaning to it. If you take a history class, history refers to the written record only. That history is not about material culture. It's about what people wrote about the past, or in the past wrote about. Now, the problem with history is that everything that's ever been written has been written for a purpose. And that's the challenge of a historian, is to disentangle somebody's bias and their attempt to influence you, the reader, into coming around to their way of thinking. Even an economic document, right? Even a list of tables of somebody's checkbook spreadsheet or something is, you're choosing certain things to record and choosing not to record other things. There's intrinsic bias in everything that's historical because somebody chooses to write something down or write something in a particular way and chooses not to write other things down and not write in another way. So how is archaeology different? Well, you don't choose what you leave behind accidentally. If you have a hole in your pocket and stuff falls out on the ground, you didn't choose for that to happen. If you don't recognize that you had that hole in your pocket, you're going to have stuff littered around the ground that you won't be able to pick up. That's what the archaeologists do. So archaeologists' information is piecemeal, it's accidental, and it's not particularly good information, but it's honest information. Nobody's trying to fool the archaeologist. Nobody's trying to say, okay, 1,000 years from now, they're going to look at this and I'm totally going to fool them. That's not the way it works. An abandoned, ruined house was left there for a reason, and it's the archaeologist's job to try and understand why it was abandoned and what happened before it was abandoned. To give you an example of how this works in more recent times, there was in I think the 1980s, William Rathje in Tucson, Arizona, did a project that he called Garbology. And what he did was he compared cultural anthropology to archaeology. And he gave a questionnaire out to a group of people and asked for their permission to look through their garbage. And he said, okay, how much of this particular type of food do you eat? How much junk food do you eat? How many packs of chips do you eat? How many Twinkies do you eat? That sort of thing. And on the piece of paper, the questionnaire that everybody filled out, they were very low in their junk food that they consumed. But because they had given permission for the archaeologists to come and go through their garbage, they found that actually there was a lot more junk food that was eaten. People were not being honest on the questionnaire. And that is where archaeology doesn't tell you the whole picture, but what it does tell you about the past is very honest. Now, before history, this is what we call prehistory, that's the only thing we have to go on. And so we look at things like the fossil record, the bones and the impressions of bones, past climates and ecology, to understand our evolutionary history and the development of our culture from the past. So that's really what the archaeological perspective is. And this tells us how we came to be who we are today. That we didn't just come from nowhere. The reasons why we have these physiological and cultural adaptations is because of these reasons that only archaeology really can get to the bottom of. Now, physical anthropology is something that archaeology brings up the raw data, and a physical anthropologist or a biological anthropologist is interested in analyzing the details of the physiology of humans. And this can be paleoanthropology, which is looking at our past and even remote past. Also, the study of our closest living relatives, other primates. We're primates, but so are orangutans and chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas and siamangs. And so looking at how we are the same and how we're different from other primates can say, okay, well, yeah, we all have forward-facing eyes, we all have hair, and we all have certain birthing patterns and all these sorts of things. We have certain diets, but we're different in this other way. That helps us to define what a human is as opposed to some other creature out there. Also, understanding humans and their biological variation requires us to understand things like our genetics. So how does our body know to become a human body? Well, because our genes tell it to be. You were at one point a single cell, and that cell became 2, and that 2 became 4, and those 4 became 16, and now you're more than 1 trillion cells. But your body was created by guidance from DNA, which is a molecular chain which gives instructions for how your biological organism is built. But the genetics are just the starting point. They're the instructions. The real world comes in, and you may never have the physical features that your genetics are programming you to become may never be fulfilled because the environment may get in the way sometime. You may have breathed in particulates when you were young and you got asthma. That wasn't in your genes to have asthma, but you got it anyway. Or maybe you didn't grow to 6 feet tall that your genes were instructing you to be, but maybe some nutritional deficiencies at a certain age in life prevented you from making it all the way to 6 feet tall. And so human growth and development is another thing that biological or physical anthropologists study. But we're also very plastic. It's not just genetics, genotype creating a phenotype, which is the sort of built body. It's also the fact that once you're living, you can adapt and change to a lot of different scenarios. We can live on the moon if we wanted to. We've got people in space stations. Our bodies aren't built for that, but we can adapt and to things like low gravity and high altitude and hot sun and cold weather. We've got people stationed in Antarctica. That's not where we come from. We're not Antarctic creatures. We're in our lifetimes, there's probably going to be somebody that goes to Mars. We're not Martians, but we can adapt to those environments because, first of all, our bodies are very plastic. We actually can adapt in real time to a real range of scenarios. But we also have culture to help us adapt. That if it gets really cold, I can put clothes on. If there's no oxygen in space, we can bring oxygen with us. And so this is where physical anthropologists see that it's a continuum between biology and culture, and this is what's called the biocultural approach to anthropology. Now, culture exists not just in your brain, and we're going to talk a bit more about the way culture forms, but it's not just in you, it's also comes out of you and into other people's brains, and out of other people's brains and into your brain. But how does that happen? That's through communication. And understanding social aspects of humans also requires us to understand our communication. So linguistic anthropology is an entirely separate subfield of anthropology as well. And sociolinguistics is the interplay between the languages and the symbolism that we use in context of the society that uses it. This can be done looking at things like the way languages function generally speaking. How do we make sounds? How do we hear sounds? How do we create symbols? How do we understand symbols? And how our brains interpret that. So there's a physiological aspect to this. We also can look at this in time. So where do these languages come from? Where did the first languages form? What was the creatures that first used languages? Was it just humans? Are humans the only creatures that use language? Or is there a sort of a development that takes place in our past? So these are things that historical linguistics can be used to understand our present day. And also, even thought itself can be understood to be linguistic in some way. That you may have some idea that's swirling around in your head, but you've really got to articulate it in some way that you can actually then express it for it to really be a fully functioning idea. And there's philosophers and theorists. Ludwig Wittgenstein, for instance, thought that you can't have thought without language. I may or may not disagree with him, but it represents the fact that language is extremely important to the way we formulate ideas, and differences in languages can create different thought patterns. So different languages and different cultures and different communities can think differently about the same things because their languages construct it differently, the ideas differently. And these relationships between society and linguistics is called sociolinguistics. You might be thinking, okay, anthropology, it's so broad-ranged, but there's some things that I haven't mentioned here. So what about sociology? Isn't that another separate discipline? Yes, it is. But frankly, anthropology, because the word says the study of humans, you can include sociology as a sort of a cousin, a related discipline. Sociologists tend to look at industrialized societies, and they look at big picture, big data. So health statistics from the United States would be something a sociologist might look at. Now, is that of use for anthropologists? Totally, of course. An anthropologist would love to get their hands on sociological data. And in fact, anthropology and sociology are convergent disciplines, that sociologists use anthropological data and anthropologists use sociological data. one difference, though, is that anthropologists tend to do in-depth analysis of ethnographies, which sociologists don't tend to do. Sociologists are sort of a top-down, they look at big patterns over wide areas, and they gather lots and lots of rather superficial data on from a big picture standpoint. That's of use to anthropologists, but what anthropologists do, or that sociologists tend not to do, is to look at the fine-grained particularities of a specific culture and describe those daily use sort of patterns. So you can see where they could be complementary and convergent. Also, psychology is something that anthropology is relies upon specialists. It's not a subdiscipline of anthropology, it's a separate discipline, but certainly psychology is about humans and about the issues of development, cognition, psychoanalysis, and anthropologists can use this information perhaps to even talk about the psychology of whole groups of people and their variations. And so you can have an ethnology using psychology. And in fact, at College of Southern Nevada, sociology, anthropology, and psychology are all part of the human behavior department, which is pretty telling that we're all sort of sister disciplines, with all trying to describe different aspects of anthropology, of humans. And of course, as I mentioned before, these things that you learn from an objective standpoint can be applied to practical purposes. And we'll have a different chapter a little bit later on about the applications of anthropology. Now, before I finish, I want to say that the key thing that we're trying to do here is be objective. I don't want you to think of anthropology as a series of opinions or anecdotes. That is something that anybody can do anytime, and they're probably going to end up being wrong about it. What anthropologists tend to or try to do is to apply the scientific method. Now, I want to bring up one term that I'll come back to this later on when we start talking about evolution. When the scientific use of certain terms is different from the normal everyday use of terms. So when I say the word theory to you, you might think, oh, okay, theory equals a guess, or just I think it's this way. Oh, that's just a theory, right? In science, that is not what theory means. Theory is one of the most important and overarching concepts in the entirety of science. That gravity exists within a theoretical framework. A theory is larger than a law. A law fits within a theory. And so Newtonian physics, you don't walk down the street and say, Newtonian physics is just a theory. I might just fly off into space. No, we know that Newtonian physics works. Nobody questions that. You don't have to question that. Now, are there limits to Newtonian physics? Yes, on a quantum level, we've come to the limits of where Newtonian physics works, and there's probably some link where gravity and quantum physics and Newtonian gravity and Newtonian physics in Newtonian physics and quantum mechanics come together. We haven't found where those two different theories come together yet. The theory of evolution is not just a guess about the way things work. They are the way things work. They can be tested, they can be proven. It is a fact. So in science, theory is not a guess. It is a fact, but it is also larger than just a fact. It's where all the facts fit. It's the scaffolding that holds up our entire understanding of the world. It's a framework. What you might mean, or what people on the street and every day might mean by a guess, is what science calls a hypothesis. So a theory is not a guess at all. It is a proven system. But a hypothesis is something within that system that you say, I think that the world works this way. But for it to be science, you have to be able to test that. You need to be able to say, I think that it is this way. You make an observation and you make a hypothetical statement. You say, this is the way the world works. And if for it to be science, you have to be able to say you're wrong. You have to be able to say, nope, that's not true. So you have a hypothesis. I think the world works this way. And you have to, for it to be science, you have to say, if that's the case, then this should happen. And that's where the experiment comes in. That's where the testability, the falsifiability comes in, where you can say, if my hypothesis is right, then we should see this result. And if you don't see that result, then that hypothesis is incorrect. And then you have to start over again and come up with a new hypothesis. The reason why this is really important is because some of our understanding of the way the world works is just so intuitive and it assumes knowledge. But what anthropology is trying to do is to say, no, let's test this. Let's make sure we're certain about this. I don't want to just assume that what somebody tells me is true. I want to test it. I want to verify it. And I want to build up a big data set. In anthropology, you tend to find things like associations between phenomena. So in human groups, you might say, okay, this group of people behaves in a particular way. Why is that? Why do they do that? Now, from an emic perspective, they might tell you, it's because of this magical process. And you, as the ethic anthropologist, would say, I'm not sure that I believe in magic. Let's test it. Let's see what, if there's another explanation for that can be a little bit more, have a little more explanatory value. And so, for instance, in your book, there's the example of that John Whiting had about a connection between a particular behavioral practice in some groups where there's a prohibition on having sex after giving birth for a period of time. Now, why would that be? He had a hypothesis that it was because this group had a low-protein diet that this taboo against having sex postpartum for a postpartum period was advantageous to the health of babies because they breastfeed longer if you don't have sex and you don't get pregnant again. So there was, for the cultural, from the emic perspective, it was a taboo. It was something that was just forbidden because that's what culture told you to do. But what John Whiting found was that actually there's another variable involved here, which is the health of the babies. So there is something that maybe was not acknowledged on an emic level, but has explanatory value from an ethic perspective, from the